Welcome, dear listeners, to the Carolina Haints podcast, brought to you by Wreak Havoc Productions and A Darker World. I'm your host, Dan Sellers. In 1959, Jacqueline Ashley lived with her parents in Charleston, but they also owned a beach house in Pawleys Island, South Carolina. She liked to go up there during the off-season when she felt like being alone. One week, in late September, she took some time off from work for a long weekend. Thursday afternoon, she took the 75-mile drive straight up Highway 17 to Pawleys Island. She changed into some comfortable clothes and lazed on the sofa to read a book. She dozed off and woke at dusk a couple hours later. Jacqueline enjoyed taking a walk at night or in the early morning when the air was cool and the beach was empty, or mostly empty. She passed one of her neighbors doing some surf fishing, and they exchanged hellos before she walked on. She reached the end of the island and turned to walk back home. At one point, she stopped to pick up a seashell and realized that there was a man a couple hundred feet behind her on the beach. She knew most of the people who lived there on the island, but she didn't recognize him. He made her feel nervous, but she didn't want to run. Instead, she quickened her pace, and after a few minutes, she glanced back again. She was shocked to see that the man had also sped up. He was still a couple hundred feet behind her, though. She passed the place where the fisherman had been, but he was now gone. She glanced back once more and breathed a sigh of relief when she saw that he had stopped following her. He was standing on one of the dunes, looking out to sea. She laughed at herself for being so paranoid. He was just like her, out taking a walk to clear his head and think. But then, as she watched, the man faded away. Then she did run, all the way back home. Jacqueline made herself a cup of hot chocolate before going to bed, and as she did, she heard a rumble of thunder and the pitter-patter of rain on the roof. She tossed and turned that night, trying to sleep. She woke up several times, and each time it seemed as if the rain was heavier than before. Just after sunrise, she got out of the bed and checked on the storm. She knew the sun was up, but she could hardly tell through the darkened skies of the storm. She threw back the curtains, and there, standing on the beach, she saw a man. That same man who had followed her on the beach. Suddenly, the nervousness she had felt the previous evening came flooding back to her. She turned to go back to bed when there was a sudden and frantic knock at the door. Cautiously, she opened the door to see the man who had followed her on the beach. But how? Only seconds had passed since she had seen him on the beach. How had he covered the distance so quickly? She started to slam the door in his face, but he seemed as frightened as she was, perhaps more so. "You must leave the island immediately," he yelled over the weather. "A severe storm is going to strike soon." He seemed genuinely worried. She wasn't sure how to reply. "Do you hear me, girl? It's important that you leave right away." Yes, she said. "I'll leave now." She rushed to gather her things and ran to the car. Driving through the heavy rain, she questioned whether she was doing the right thing. Surely, she was in more danger out here than back in bed. But the old man frightened her, so she kept driving all the way back to her parents' house in Charleston. That afternoon, she heard on the radio that the storm had a name: Hurricane Gracie. Then she realized who the old man must have been. Of course, he was just someone from the civil defense telling her to evacuate the island. The following weekend, she returned to the island and found that many of the homes and businesses had been damaged. Fearing the worst, she continued toward the family's beach house, but their house had survived the storm unscathed. Many others weren't so lucky. She went down to the shelter to see if she could be of any help. She also wanted to find the old man who had warned her. She wanted to thank him, but she also wanted to apologize for acting so weird. She asked around, but no one had sent out a warning. You see, it would be another year before the first weather satellite was launched. The sheriff said that they had very little warning themselves. Jacqueline was confused. A couple of older women overheard her. "I bet he was dressed all in gray, wasn't he?" one of them asked. "Why, yes he was." "Uh-huh," said the second woman knowingly. "That's the gray man, all right." Jacqueline's parents had moved to South Carolina when she was young. She had never heard of the gray man. The two women told her the legend of a young man who had just returned from a long stint at sea. He and a friend were in a hurry to head home, to Pawleys Island. This was 1822, so they went straight to the stables to get their horses. The young man was much more impatient than his traveling companion. His girlfriend was waiting on him, and he planned to ask her for her hand in marriage. As they entered more familiar territory close to the island, the young man suggested that they cut across the marshland. It would cut an hour out of their trip, maybe more. But his companion pointed out that the sun would be setting soon. It would be too dangerous to navigate the marsh in the dark. The young man would not be swayed, and he cut across the marshland alone. The next morning, the young man still hadn't arrived home. The girlfriend went to the man's traveling companion to see if he could shed any light to his whereabouts. The other man was immediately concerned and gathered together a group to help him search for the young man. They quickly found his horse beside a deep, marshy pool of water. They searched it and pulled out the young man's lifeless body. Just a couple hundred yards from the solid ground, his horse had run into deep mud and thrown him into the pool, where he drowned. The young man's girlfriend was distraught. The only time she even left the house was to take her evening stroll along the beach. Weeks passed, and she was no less heartbroken. Then, one evening during her walk, she saw a man, dressed in gray, standing in the distance. He didn't see her. He stood on the beach staring out to sea. The way the man held himself reminded her of... But that was impossible. She almost turned around to hurry back home, but she kept walking toward the man who stared stoically out to sea. She didn't think the man noticed her approaching, but he suddenly turned and called to her by name. The girl was shocked. It was her lover. She wanted to wrap her arms around him and ask how he could be alive. And she wanted to punch him for not coming back to her sooner. But before she could do any of that, he told her to leave the island right away. He insisted that it wasn't safe to stay. Then, before she could say anything, he disappeared right before her eyes. She ran back home and convinced her parents that they had to leave the island. When they returned a week later, they discovered that a hurricane had devastated the whole island. Only one home remained standing, theirs. Now, as with most legends, There are various versions of this tale. Some even give the young man a name. There has been much speculation about the true identity of the Gray Man. Some people think he's Percival Pawley, the island's namesake. Others claim that it's Plowton Charles Jonrett Weston, a prominent landowner who once lived in a house that stood on the current site of the Pelican Inn. And a few even believe that it's Edward Teach, old Blackbeard himself. But no one knows for sure who the Gray Man is, and no one ever will. What we do know is that the Gray Man will often appear before a hurricane or storm. On average, a hurricane hits the area of South Carolina once every 4 years, with 1 in 10 being major storms, Category 4 or worse. The more severe the storm, the more likely the Gray Man will be seen. He tends to avoid groups, showing himself to small numbers of people, most often couples. Not only does he warn them of the impending danger, but he also seems to protect their belongings during the storm. There have been 5 major hurricanes since 1822. There are very few records of the Great Carolina Hurricane that hit in 1893, but we do know that it killed around 2,000 people, the 3rd deadliest hurricane to hit the mainland United States. There's a nearby museum that contains the story of a Pawleys Island resident who was saved from the storm by the Gray Man. The next big storm was Hurricane Hazel in 1954. In a story that is reminiscent of Jacqueline's, a couple rented a house on the island for their honeymoon. Very early one morning, before the sun had come up, they were awakened by a persistent knocking at the front door. The man tried to ignore it, but his new wife insisted that he go see who it was. The man, now pretty upset, grabbed the poker from the fireplace before jerking open the front door. He encountered a man dressed in all gray who stood before him. The Gray Man ignored the fire poker inches from his face and told the man that he needed to leave the island. The man didn't know what to think, but then the Gray Man simply faded away. The couple left at daybreak. They were terrified and confused, but also pissed that their honeymoon had been ruined by this rude and thoughtless ghost. But of course, when they returned home, they heard of Hurricane Hazel on the radio. Just 5 years later, Hurricane Gracie struck the area. I've already told you that story. There would not be another Category 4 until 1989, when Hurricane Hugo would hit just north of Charleston and maintain hurricane force winds as far inland as Charlotte. But the day before Hurricane Hugo made landfall, the Gray Man appeared to Jim and Clara Moore while they were walking on the beach. Usually, there would have been dozens of people on the beach, even that late in the season. But on this day, they only saw one. A man in gray who walked straight toward them before disappearing in broad daylight. Hurricane Hugo wiped out every home in Moore's neighborhood, except theirs. And just 1 year ago, the Carolinas were rocked by Hurricane Florence. Some believe that the security cameras on Pawleys Island Pier captured the ghost walking around during the night. You can Google the video, which is unconvincing as far as evidence of the paranormal goes, but there's no denying that something is there. And it is gray, and it's vaguely human-shaped. The Gray Man has been featured on 2 television series: the 2014 American Supernatural series on the Weather Channel, and Season 3 of Unsolved Mysteries. You can learn more about the Gray Man by reading Nancy Roberts' South Carolina Ghosts from the Coast to the Mountains. Check out mysteriousuniverse.org. There's astonishinglegends.com, myrtlebeachonline.com, and southernliving.com. This episode was researched and written by Jeffrey Cochran. It was narrated and produced by me, Dan Sellers. You can find everything that Jeff's up to at his company at adarkerworld.com. And you can find everything that I'm up to at wreakhavocproductions.com. You can find the Carolina Haints podcast on iTunes, Google Play, and YouTube, as well as straight from the RSS feed at carolinahaints.libsyn.com. If you haven't already, don't forget to sign up for our company's quarterly newsletter. It's called Wreak Havoc All Access, and it'll keep you up to date with everything that we're up to, including new movies and new podcasts. You can sign up for it from our website, wreakhavocproductions.com, or you can find us on Facebook, facebook.com/wreakhavocproductions. We're on Instagram at Wreak Havoc Productions, and I'm on Twitter at Hank vs. the Undead. You can email me your thoughts and questions at wreakhavocproductions@gmail.com. I love hearing from listeners of the show, and I also love it when you leave us reviews on iTunes. Please take a second, give us a 5-star rating, and leave a little message. It truly helps us to be more visible for other listeners. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. Tune in then to hear more about the things that go bump in the night.